Welcome to our deep dive into morality.
Mhm.
You've given us some fascinating audio excerpts from a lecture series, and I gotta say, I'm already hooked. The idea that morality evolves, that it's not static, really got my attention.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area, and these lectures really go deep into it. What's interesting is how they connect individual character with the forces that shape societies. Even things like science and reason play a role.
Yeah. When I saw the phrase moral Flynn effect, I was like, wait, what? Is our moral reasoning actually getting sharper over time?
Yeah.
And then there's this whole Leviathan concept. Is a strong state the only way to keep us from, descending into chaos?
Those are great questions, and the lectures definitely explore those in detail. But before we get there, they start with this really interesting foundation. The survival and flourishing of individual sentient beings is the fundamental starting point for morality.
Okay, so not just an abstract greater good, but focusing on each person's well-being. Why does that shift matter so much?
Well, it changes our whole perspective. Instead of looking at morality through this lens of abstract groups, we're focusing on the concrete experiences of individuals. The lectures argue that when we lose sight of individual rights in favor of the group, well, that's when we see things like historical atrocities and mass suffering.
It's easy to say protect the individual, but doesn't that get tricky in practice? Like,
Yeah.
what about situations where individual desires clash with the needs of the larger community? The lectures touch on some pretty dark historical examples, right?
Absolutely. It's definitely a complex issue, and the lectures don't shy away from that complexity at all. They talk about things like the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary people placed in positions of power ended up becoming authoritarian and abusive. It shows how easy it is for us to slip into this us versus them thinking and dehumanize others when we prioritize group identity over individual dignity.
Yeah, that experiment was chilling. It really shows how even good people can do terrible things under the right conditions. And it makes me think about things like rights revolutions, like the Bill of Rights. Was that a direct response to this danger of sacrificing the individual for the group?
The lectures actually make that connection directly. The Bill of Rights and other documents like it are designed to protect individual freedoms from what they call the tyranny of the majority, to make sure that certain rights are untouchable no matter what group you belong to.
So it's like a safeguard to prevent those dark chapters of history from repeating themselves, where individuals were sacrificed in the name of some so-called greater good. Okay, so if individual flourishing is the goal, how do we get there?
Well, that's where the lectures make a pretty bold claim. They argue that science and reason are the key drivers of moral progress.
Science and reason. It sounds almost too simple. How can something as complex as morality be boiled down to just that?
It's not about oversimplifying things, but about approaching moral questions with a particular mindset. And that starts with defining our terms. Science at its core is a method of discovery, a way of testing our ideas against reality.
So it's about evidence, not just gut feelings or what seems right.
Exactly, and that's where reason comes in. Reason is the ability to use logic and evidence and critical thinking to come to conclusions, to weigh different options, and to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's about taking that scientific method, observation, evidence testing, and using it to make moral decisions.
Exactly. To give you an example, the lectures bring up this fascinating historical anecdote about the Duke of Brunswick who ran an experiment on a woman accused of witchcraft.
Wait, an experiment. On a witch. What does that have to do with science and reason?
Well, just hang on. It's a great example of how even in really dark times, that glimmer of reason can still emerge. The Duke, convinced of this woman's guilt, subjected her to torture, which was pretty common back then. But there was this Jesuit scholar, Frederick Spee, who was observing, and he began to question the whole idea of torture as a reliable way to get information.
I can see where this is going. Torture just makes people say whatever they need to make the pain stop, whether it's true or not.
That's right. Spee realized that confessions obtained under torture were totally unreliable. And this led him to a profound insight that if we base our moral judgments on flawed methods like torture, we're going to get to flawed conclusions. It's a great example of how using reason, even in the context of witch hunts, can lead to moral progress.
Wow. So this guy's questioning torture in the middle of witch hunts. It's a pretty powerful example of how reason can challenge even really deeply held beliefs. But how do we get from those, little sparks of reason to big societal changes? Like, how does a whole society actually shift its thinking about right and wrong?
Well, that's where the lectures bring up this concept of shifting theories of causality. They use the term witch theory of causality to describe how people used to explain bad things happening. They'd blame it on supernatural forces or on people like witches. Basically, a lack of scientific understanding that led to some pretty bad solutions.
Yeah, like burning people at the stake.
Hmm.
Not a very nuanced approach to problem solving.
Yeah,
But the lectures say we've moved beyond that magical thinking, right?
that's right. They argue that we've shifted to what they call a public health model for dealing with social problems. It's about looking at things like gun violence not as good versus evil, but as complex problems with causes that we can actually try to understand and fix.
Okay, that's interesting. Give me an example. Like, how does that play out in the real world?
Take gun violence. Instead of blaming individuals or coming up with simple solutions, the public health approach is more about asking, what are the systemic factors contributing to this?
Mhm.
Like, what's the role of poverty? Or access to mental health care? What about even our culture's glorification of violence?
So it's less about punishing people and more about getting a bigger picture of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. This shift has a huge impact on how we approach all sorts of social challenges, like poverty, crime, addiction, inequality. It's about really analyzing the situation, gathering data, testing out different solutions, kind of like how a doctor would approach a disease.
I like that analogy. It makes it much easier to grasp. So we've got science to help us understand what causes problems, but how do we actually build a better world then? One that's safer and more just, and where people's rights are protected. The lectures mention this idea of the Leviathan. What is that exactly?
The Leviathan, as described by Thomas Hobbes, is essentially a strong state, a really powerful governing body that's needed to stop chaos and enforce the rules of society. It's this trade-off between individual freedom and security.
Hmm. Okay, so we need some kind of authority to keep things from falling apart. But doesn't that sound a little well authoritarian? Like, do we have to give up that much control just to have order?
That's a good point. And the lectures definitely acknowledge that tension. It's not about blindly obeying authority. They emphasize checks and balances on power, making sure the Leviathan doesn't become a tyrant. They quote James Madison, who said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. So even with good intentions, we need to limit power."
So it's finding that right balance between freedom and the need for order and safety. How do we make sure that balance doesn't tip too far in either direction?
The lectures highlight how important individual rights and liberties are for keeping that balance. They quote Edmund Burke, who said, "The restraints on men as well as their liberties are to be reckoned among their rights." It's like a reminder that a good society doesn't just give you freedom, it also puts limits on power to protect those freedoms.
Right, that ties back to the Bill of Rights and all those documents that guarantee individual liberties. But how do we guarantee those rights are protected if the state has so much power?
That's where the idea of democratic elections comes in. Think of it like a science experiment. We're testing out different ideas like political platforms against reality, what voters choose. It lets us adapt and change course because ultimately the power rests with the people.
So it's like we're constantly running these experiments, trying to find the best way to govern ourselves, to balance those needs for freedom and security. But are we getting any better at this? Is there any evidence that we're actually moving towards a more moral world with less violence?
That's a fascinating question. And the lecture suggests there's actually a lot of evidence to support that idea. They talk about a trend they call the expanding moral circle. The idea is that over time, our sense of empathy and compassion has grown beyond just our own tribe or nation to include a much wider range of people and even other species.
That sounds hopeful.
Yeah.
But are we really just getting nicer as a species? Or is there something more practical going on? What does this mean for the future?
It's probably a combination of things. And the lectures go into some really interesting historical data. For example, they point out that pre-state societies were extremely violent. Homicide rates were way higher than anything we see in modern states.
So maybe Hobbes had a point with that whole state of nature being a war of all against all.
Well, Hobbes might have oversimplified things a bit, but the data does suggest there's some truth to it. Having those strong states for all their problems seems to have really helped reduce violence.
But we can't ignore the fact that modern wars, even though they're less common, are way more destructive. It's like we've traded quantity for this concentrated devastation.
You're right. The 20th century, with its world wars and the invention of nuclear weapons, is a stark reminder of how much damage we can do.
It's like we need something more than just the state to keep us in check. Something to stop us from destroying ourselves. Is that where this interdependence idea comes in?
Exactly. Alongside the state, the lectures say that growing interdependence between nations is a major factor in promoting peace and cooperation. They highlight things like economic interdependence, where countries are less likely to go to war with their trading partners. They even quote the economist Frederick Bastiat, who said, Where goods do not cross frontiers, armies will.
So basically, it's in everyone's best interest to keep those trade routes open and those goods flowing. Makes sense from a practical perspective. But is there something deeper going on?
They also bring up something called democratic peace theory, the observation that democracies almost never fight each other.
Hmm. So there's something about democratic systems that promotes peace. Is it just because they tend to be wealthier and more interconnected, or is there something more fundamental at play?
That's something political scientists have been debating for ages. And the lectures get into some possible explanations. They suggest that things like the transparency of democratic processes, the ability to change leaders peacefully, and the focus on individual rights all contribute to a culture of dialogue and compromise that makes war less likely.
It makes me think about how we frame conflicts. If we see each other as individuals with rights, it might be harder to justify violence.
That's a great point. And we shouldn't forget the role of international organizations in promoting cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution. It's like we're building this global system of interconnectedness, a network of institutions and agreements to prevent conflict and encourage collaboration.
So it's not just about being nice to each other, it's about recognizing our shared interests and working together to solve problems. It's like a global version of that public health approach we talked about.
Exactly. We're seeing this rise of a global public health approach to international relations. Organizations like the UN are trying to tackle issues like poverty, disease, climate change, conflict prevention, recognizing that these problems go beyond national borders.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come from witch hunts and blaming witches to actually understanding how complex social systems work and how our actions affect each other.
And remember that idea of the moral Flynn effect we mentioned. If our moral reasoning really is getting sharper, it makes you wonder what new challenges we might be able to tackle in the future, what new ethical dilemmas will pop up as technology advances and our world gets even more connected.
Nuclear weapons. Yeah, it's kind of scary to think about. We're talking about all this moral progress, expanding empathy, and then there's this technology that could just wipe us all out. It seems like a huge contradiction.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the lectures don't shy away from that. They get into the whole history of nuclear weapons, the idea of deterrence, and this crazy concept of mutual assured destruction, or MADD, which is a pretty fitting name.
Yeah, Mad D, it's kind of fitting given what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But is that really the best we could do? Just hope that nobody ever pushes the button.
The lectures acknowledge that deterrence, even though it might have worked during the Cold War, is a pretty shaky solution at best. It depends on everybody being rational, but history is full of examples of people making irrational decisions and things going wrong in ways nobody expected.
And what about the ethics of it all? Even if Mad D does work, isn't it wrong to threaten to just destroy millions of innocent people?
They go into that ethical dilemma too. They point out that nuclear weapons can't tell the difference between soldiers and civilians. They just destroy everything. The fact that they even exist raises some serious questions about how committed we really are to protecting people and valuing human life.
It's like going backwards to that primitive us versus them mentality, where we're willing to kill tons of people just to protect our own group. But if deterrence isn't a good solution, what are the alternatives?
They argue that we need to move beyond deterrence and work towards a world without these weapons. They suggest a bunch of things like reducing stockpiles, strengthening international agreements, and dealing with the root causes of conflict that make these weapons seem necessary in the first place.
But that requires a lot of trust and cooperation, which seems hard to find these days, especially with all the tension between different countries and more countries getting nuclear weapons.
It's a huge challenge, for sure. But the lectures remind us that throughout history, people have solved seemingly impossible problems by working together, talking to each other, and finding common ground.
Like that saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Maybe getting rid of nuclear weapons feels impossible now. But if we keep pushing for it, maybe someday it'll happen. But nukes aren't the only threat. The lectures talk about terrorism too. How does that fit into this whole idea of evolving morality?
Terrorism is a different kind of challenge for our moral systems. It's intentional violence, often against innocent people, and it's usually justified by beliefs that seem totally strange to us today.
It's hard to know even where to start with that. Like, what motivates terrorists? Are they just evil, like some people say?
That's where the lectures make a really interesting point. They say a lot of what we think we know about terrorism is actually wrong, and that prevents us from finding good solutions. For instance, people often think that terrorists just hate freedom and democracy.
Yeah, that's something we hear a lot, especially after 9/11.
But the lectures say that's too simple. They point to research that shows terrorists are driven by lots of different things: political grievances, a need for revenge, a feeling of being powerless or humiliated, even a messed up sense of honor or duty.
So it's not that they hate our freedoms, it's more like they feel wronged, like their values are being attacked.
Exactly. And the lectures argue that if we really want to stop terrorism, we need to understand those underlying motivations. They say that just using military force can actually make things worse and create more terrorists.
So it's about addressing the root causes, like poverty, inequality, political oppression.
Those things definitely contribute, but it's not always so simple. They point out that a lot of terrorists come from middle-class families, some even have college degrees. It's not just about being poor, it's about feeling alienated and like they don't have a purpose, like nobody's listening to them and their identity is under threat.
So what do we do then? Just give them a hug and say it's all going to be okay.
Not quite. They advocate for a multi-pronged approach, combining targeted military action with things like diplomacy, economic development, promoting democracy and human rights, and fostering understanding between cultures. It's about building societies where people feel heard, respected, and empowered to address their problems peacefully.
So we have to fight the ideology behind terrorism, not just the terrorists themselves. But that sounds really hard.
Yeah.
How do we change people's hearts and minds on such a large scale?
The lectures emphasize how important it is to understand the psychology of terrorism, how it manipulates our fears and emotions. They caution against overreacting in ways that actually help the terrorists.
So it's about staying calm, being rational, and focusing on long-term solutions, even when faced with horrible acts of violence.
Exactly. And they give historical examples of how nonviolent movements have been super effective at creating political change, often with way less bloodshed and lasting consequences than violent revolutions. Think of people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. They showed the power of peaceful resistance to fight injustice and inspire real change.
They're great examples that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. It seems like there's this constant struggle between our destructive side and our ability to empathize and cooperate with each other.
That struggle's been going on throughout history, but the encouraging thing is, as the lectures suggest, the overall trend seems to be towards less violence, more cooperation, and a growing sense of compassion.
So maybe we are getting better at this whole being human thing. What about the future, though? What new moral problems might come up as technology keeps advancing and the world becomes even more interconnected?
That's where the lectures get really mind-blowing. They talk about things like artificial intelligence and biotechnology fields that are moving so fast, bringing up all these huge ethical questions.
AI, gene editing, that stuff sounds like science fiction. How does it relate to morality?
Think about it. We're creating machines that can think, learn, and maybe even become smarter than humans. What are our ethical responsibilities to these AI entities? Do they deserve rights? And with gene editing, we're talking about actually changing life itself. How do we decide what's okay and what's not? When does curing diseases become enhancing human capabilities?
Whoa, these are some deep philosophical questions. What does it mean to be human? What is consciousness? Where does morality even come from?
Those are questions that have been around forever, and now we have to answer them in a practical way. The lectures encourage us to approach these challenges with the same scientific mindset we've been talking about. Being open-minded, thinking critically, relying on evidence, and being willing to change our minds as we learn more.
So no snap judgments, no giving in to fear or dogma.
Right. It's about having these thoughtful conversations, considering different viewpoints, and being open to adjusting our moral compass as we learn more.
It's a lot to ask, but it's also kind of exciting. Like, we're not just watching this moral evolution happen, we're actually part of it shaping the future with every choice we make.
That's exactly the message they want to get across. The future of morality isn't set in stone. It's something we create together through our choices, our actions, and our commitment to reason and compassion.
So what does all this mean for you, listener? How will you use this scientific way of thinking in your own life when you face moral dilemmas, big or small?
The lectures challenge us to be more mindful, more deliberate in our ethical decision-making, to not just accept things as they are, but to constantly question, evaluate, and try to do better.
It's about being engaged, citizens, informed voters, and kind human beings. It's about taking responsibility for the world we're creating one moral choice at a time.
And that, my friend, is probably the most hopeful and empowering message of all. We're not just passengers on this moral journey, we're the ones steering the ship.
That's all for this deep dive. We've covered a lot, from witch hunts to the Leviathan, from nuclear weapons to the ethics of AI. But the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing that moral arc forward. Until next time, stay curious.